AskHistorians Aloud. In this special episode series, we'll be bringing you curated audio content. This series features questions and answers from our subreddit, provided by our amazing Flair panel. This is a way of casting light on the great questions and answers that are happening every day at Ask Historians. To learn more, or for even more content, follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Please also check out the Patreon, which goes towards supporting this endeavor.
In answer to the question, are there any written accounts of lesbians in medieval and Renaissance time? Asked by Ocean Grew Hands. Answered by Cleopatra Philopater. And an apology from me, your reader, for any mispronunciations in Arabic or non-English languages. Great question. While I cannot speak for medieval Europe, I can shine some light on what Middle Eastern authors had to say about lesbians and other queer women in the Middle Ages. So to begin with it is worth pointing out that modern sexual identities are just that, modern, and they are often inadequate to describe ideas of sexuality, eroticism, desire, and identity in the pre-modern world. This is not to say that social and sexual roles did not play an important role in shaping pre-modern identities, just that medieval women and men would have interpreted themselves in a very different way than we might today. The term lesbian is actually a good example of the limitations of projecting modern sexuality onto the past. It was coined in the 19th century and is derived from later interpretations of 7th century BC poet Sappho, a native of Lesbos, as a queer woman. By the early 21st century, it has acquired many different connotations and transformed into a distinct sexual identity with an associated subculture. Not to mention that exactly who counts as a bona fide lesbian is an endlessly moving goalpost. For instance, it is unfair to leave out women who might have been sexually intimate with both men and women by defining lesbians as those women who are exclusively attracted to women. Can we include sexual attraction in the absence of sexual contact between women? And if so, how do we go about finding certain examples of this with our limited body of evidence? Equally important, modern conceptions of quote-unquote lesbianism carry strong associations with contemporary feminist thought and gender studies, ideas which would have been totally alien to the medieval world. To be a quote-unquote lesbian would have meant something quite different to a woman in the medieval world than what it might mean to women in the 20th and 21st century. Nevertheless, medieval Arabic had many terms that are broadly equivalent to the term lesbian in the sense that they refer to women who were sexually or romantically attracted to other women and who pursued same-sex relationships. If I were discussing ancient Greeks or the Roman Empire, this is the point where I would add a disclaimer about how sexual identities and subcultures based around sexual identity did not exist, but this is not strictly speaking true of the medieval Islamic world. This means that we can piece together an answer to your question, and for the sake of brevity and clarity, I am going to use the term lesbian as a broad umbrella for homosexual women and same-sex relationship between women. Religion obviously played a key role in dictating the ethics and morality of sexuality in medieval society, but it's equally clear that religious ideas changed dramatically over time and they did not always line up with reality. Medieval Islamic literature is not entirely straightforward in its attitudes towards same-sex desire, but it appears that religious prohibition of homosexuality did not become a major influence over sexual expression until at least the 13th century. Firstly, it is important to note that lawful sex and sexual desire as a whole was viewed quite positively in medieval Islam, where it was more or less a necessary evil to medieval Christianity. This more generally sex-positive attitude probably played a large role in the relatively more lenient attitude towards homosexuality. By and large, the unforgivable sexual sin in the medieval Islamic kind was adultery, and this occurred between a man and a woman. Male homosexuality, particularly anal penetration, is often compared to adultery in Islamic jurisprudence. Sak was similarly seen as criminal, but warranting a lighter punishment than liwat, sodomy, or zina, adultery. The religious condemnation of homosexuality seems to have been largely ignored by society as a whole at times during the medieval and Renaissance period. Homosexual relationships, cross-dressing, and genderqueer identities were openly celebrated by the upper levels of Islamic society during the Abbasid and Mamluk periods, among them lesbian sexualities and female cross-dressing. This contributed to the production of an overwhelming abundance of homoerotic poetry in Islamic culture centers in the Near East, North Africa, and Al-Andalus. This is not to imply that any kind of post-gender or sexually egalitarian society existed. Far from it, just that sexual mores and acceptable behaviors extended far behind the limitations of strict religious prohibitions. Medieval Islamic perceptions of lesbians did not develop in a vacuum, but they drew heavily from pre-Islamic, Near Eastern, and classical Greek-Roman thought. To my knowledge, medieval European discourse on sexuality also drew from Greek-Roman literature, in addition to Christian morality. We can see parallels of medieval Islamic and Greek-Roman thought in the terminology used to describe lesbians and lesbian-like women. Many of the Arabic terms for female same-sex activities and orientations, for example sak, meaning lesbianism, and sakia, musakia, and sakwa, meaning lesbian, are etymologically derived from roots which denote rubbing or pounding, as in pounding or grinding spices. Greek Latin terms like fricatix and tribus have similar roots in their respective languages. The origin of these descriptive terms is fairly self-explanatory. They connote the physical aspects of sexuality, something which is fairly common for both languages. Other terms, like the Arabic nisa mutajirat, connotate masculinity and describe a woman with manly virtues or characteristics. A Latin equivalent to the term might be a virago. The etymology of these former terms tie back into the medical and anatomical explanation that ancient medieval authors had to offer for homosexuality. Mild warning, because while I will try to avoid explicit dissection of sex, I am going to briefly deep dip into medieval medical theory concerning sexual orientation and intercourse. The 2nd century AD physician Galen was supposed to have diagnosed the cause of lesbianism in his daughter as an itch between the major and minor labia. The only way to relieve this itch was by rubbing, particularly by rubbing against another woman's labia in order to cool it. This theory is echoed by 9th century scholar Al-Kindi, who claimed that, quote, lesbianism is due to a vapor, which, condensed, generates in the labia heat and an itch, which only dissolve and become cold through friction and orgasm. When friction and orgasm take place, the heat turns into coldness because the liquid that a woman ejaculates in lesbian intercourse is cold, whereas the same liquid that results from sexual union with men is hot. Heat, however, cannot be extinguished by heat. Rather, it will increase since it needs to be treated by its opposite. As coldness is repelled by heat, so heat is repelled by coldness. Unquote. Medieval Islamic literature took this medicalization of lesbian desire in other directions by postulating prenatal cases of lesbianism. Namely, the consumption of certain foods by nursing women was believed to pass through the milk and cause labia itching, and therefore lifelong lesbianism in infants. The interesting thing about all of these theories is that lesbianism was viewed as an innate biological reality which could not be reversed or cured. Obviously, the medical theory behind these diagnoses was far from sound, but it is significant that these authors believed that homosexuality was something which occurred naturally in certain individuals rather than an affliction or a perversion. This is reinforced by other medieval Islamic literary traditions which mention homosexuality in humans and in animals. Asl al-Aliyah al-Arabiya cites the 8th century scholar al-Jaheth, who reports homosexuality and bisexuality as a natural condition in both male and female pigeons, as well as humans. This is succinctly summed up in one line, quote, there are men who do not want women and women who do not want men, unquote. However, fixating on physical acts and outright desire makes the task of identifying lesbians in medieval literature a bit difficult, because it limits our scope to women who actively engage in sexual relations with other women. This leaves out, for instance, unfulfilled same-sex attraction as well as romantic friendships and non-sexual intimacy. We must also take care when figuring out where, when, and if we draw the line between strong platonic emotional attachments, homoerotic interactions, and homosexual relationships. In societies with more strictly enforced homosociality and gendered spaces, the discussion of homoeroticism becomes quite tricky. For example, women in both ancient Greek and medieval Islamic society would have been somewhat secluded from unrelated men and confined to female-dominated spaces. This means that their primary social relationships would be with other women. In such a setting, it is easy to believe that homoerotic and even homosexual interactions between women would flourish as much as they did between men. However, it's equally problematic to assume that homosociality would cause homosexual and homoerotic attachments, rather than simply creating a space where existing impulses might be more lightly regulated or even encouraged. For this reason, I always shy away from drawing broad correlations between societies. The late 10th century Encyclopedia of Pleasure includes the story of Hind bint al-Numan, a Christian princess from modern-day Iraq, and al-Zakra, who is supposed to have been the first Arab lesbian. This relationship was praised as an example of true romantic devotion and loyalty. The 10th century scholar al-Nadim lists 12 lesbian couples known to him as well. References to associations of lesbians in medieval Arabic literature point to the existence of a lesbian subculture in the medieval Islamic world. These associations are mentioned in works like Al-Tafashi's Promenade of Hearts and are generally characterized as groups of lesbians who gather to share knowledge and associate with one another. Based on the existence of these associations of lesbians, we can conclude that a lesbian identity and possibly even a subculture of sorts existed in the medieval Islamic world, which was referenced in contemporary discourse on the subject of sexuality and women in general. The Middle East is a diverse place, and quite a bit has been written about early modern sexuality in the Middle East. As I am not prepared to write a book about the subject, I am limiting the scope of this section to the geographic area of Iran, which is itself an interesting case of duality when it comes to the acceptance of same-sex relations. The Darvish culture of classical Safavid Iran is generally considered to have been fairly liberal. Women interacted quite freely in the social sphere rather than being confined to the domestic sphere, and they exercised quite a bit of power in their lives and marriages. Safavid royal women held a good deal of power at court, with many court conspiracies and power plays being hatched within the harem. According to the 17th century French author Jean Chardin, the royal court was also home to romantic intrigue between women of the harem. Chardin claimed that the Persian harem was full of trivids, although his account of Iran is tinged with Oriental stereotypes of sexual amorality and exoticism, which clearly influenced his characterization of the harem. The reign of Shah Sultan Hussein brought a social and cultural sea change to 17th century Iran. Along with the general push for Sharia law, women's movements and social interactions outside of the home would become more restricted. This included the limitations of women's interaction with unrelated men and their participation in business and social life. The culture of veiling and seclusion in the early modern Islamic world was partly aimed at reducing the risk of adultery and thereby protecting male honor by preventing women from exchanging in extramarital affairs that would damage the reputation of their family. Interestingly, women were at times seen as threats and rivals by possessive husbands in Safavid Iran, which points to a lingering fear that same-sex attraction between women could challenge heterosexual marriages. This is something of a chink in the armor of a society which strove to prevent sexual misconduct by separating the sexes, as it was threat from within the socially constructed homosocial spheres of life. The book on the Superstitions of Women by Aqua Jamal Karasari is an insight into the lives of women in Isfahan, Iran, as the cultural shift was occurring. As such, it is a useful source on women's lives for this period. Perhaps most relevant to your question, the book mentions a vow of sisterhood, which was taken between two usually married women who had a pre-existing friendship or had at least gotten to know one another over a few months. In order to propose such a vow, the prospective woman would give a ritual doll to a respectable woman, who would act as the intermediary by delivering the doll to the woman's friend. If the recipient accepted the offer to become a, quote, adopted sister, unquote, she would send the doll back crowned with a necklace and give the go-between a dress, and if she refused, she would send the doll back with a black veil. The actual vow was officiated in front of a Mista's shrine, and by tradition it may have its roots in Sufi religious associations. According to the text, one woman was supposed to declare, "In the name of Ali the Shah, conqueror of Khaybar," and the other would reply, "O God, accept and fulfill our desire." The ceremony itself placed a certain emphasis on the figure of Ali, Muhammad's successor, and the last prophet in Islamic tradition. The vow would then be celebrated by drinking sherbet and dancing. The mention of dancing is interesting given that dancing at weddings was outlawed under the religious reforms of Sultan Hussein. It was apparently ideal for women to take a short trip together beforehand in order to judge their compatibility. But in Safavid Iran, this vow could be taken between women who did not know one another. The need to ensure compatibility makes sense as the relationship was supposed to be lifelong and intimate, with both women sharing their personal feelings and supporting one another through the ups and downs of life. The bond entailed both women dressing similarly and even inheriting property from one another. One fascinating example of this relationship was in the use of spices to send coded messages to one another. For example, a walnut signified, "I am yours, do not worry." A clove meant, "I am burning." A saffron meant, "You have made me yellow," meaning melancholic, like pounded saffron. "How long shall I eat your useless sorrow?" Cinnamon meant, "I adore you." A cracked cardamom meant, "I am in agony." A sandalwood meant, "I smell you constantly." A particular seed meant, "God damn you." I would assume that this last one was used sparingly. Perhaps more insightfully, Catherine Babian suggests that it was communicating jealousy. Both the language of these cupboard codes and the language used to describe these bonds by male authors has been suggested to have double meanings, as they frequently refer to rubbing, pounding, and eating. These bonds usually referred to as, quote, romantic friendships, unquote, by modern historians, and they were not necessarily sexual. Instead, they were built around strong emotional attachments with erotic or romantic overtones. Nonetheless, the term came to be associated negatively with a lesbian in the 1950s. The implementation of the term is partly related to male paranoia surrounding women's sexuality and close female relationships as Iranian society went through multiple cultural shifts during the 20th century. Obviously, we do not have nearly as much information about women in general and lesbians in particular as we do about men, and the surviving texts are almost exclusively authored by men. This means we are left with a fairly limited view of lesbians in medieval Islamic society, but is exceedingly rich compared to what we have to work with for the ancient Mediterranean and, as far as I know, medieval Europe. This answer was a bit all over the place geographically and temporally, and it is worth noting that medieval Middle East was and is a diverse place with many different cultures and social norms. Nevertheless, I hope this was at least kind of helpful to understanding what medieval and Renaissance literature had to say about lesbians in some parts of the world.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.